In this news roundup of the week, the threat of new restrictions in England recede in the face of the latest scientific studies into Omicron. The scientific advisors on both sides of the channel come under unprecedented attack for breach of trust, and the Christmas spirit of peace and unity unexpectedly descends upon Joe Biden and Donald Trump. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. This week, the positive news broke that several studies have shown that, wait for it, Omicron causes milder disease. I know, obviously nobody saw that coming, except of course for people who, looked at the actual emerging data over the last couple of weeks. But such people were clearly an aberration. After my last 2 weeks of highlighting the likelihood, suitably caveated mind, that Omicron was milder, I got called practically an anti-vaxxer by one commentator and held up as a mere YouTuber sounding off, rather than, for instance, Professor Neil Ferguson, who had said that there was no evidence Omicron was milder and that this could mean 5,000 deaths per day. Also, well-known science genius Boris Johnson, who said that people should put to one side any idea that Omicron was milder, as he announced that at that point the global death toll had increased to 1. I was told off for mocking Sajid Javid's prediction of 1 million cases a day by the end of the month. 1 week from today, by the way. Didn't I know how exponential growth works mathematically? Yes, indeed, and that has been the justification for every worst-case scenario sage graph we ever saw that never came to pass, which is why looking to real-world data, when it's available, can inform such numbers. So, all right. What did we know already? The South African data was properly published in preprint form earlier this week, confirming what we knew from there. People with Omicron were found to have an 80% lower likelihood of being admitted to hospital compared with other variants, and a 70% lower odds of severe disease compared to the Delta variant. We'd also seen daily reported infections in Gauteng province, which saw the earliest wave, has long since plateaued and declined. Real-world data, not maths. There are likely to be some differences between outcomes in South Africa and here due to demographics and levels of vaccination, although remember we are still talking about the same species, Homo sapiens. And that was confirmed by data from Denmark, which found the hospitalisation rate from Omicron was 60% lower than Delta and other variants. A small study in the US, too small to be fair, just over 40 people, had also indicated the same picture. We've also seen some research suggesting a mechanism for why Omicron may spread so much faster but cause less severe illness. A study was pre-announced in Hong Kong, where they suggested that Omicron replicated much more rapidly in the bronchial passages, which means a lot more live virus could be spread by an infected person, but it does so much less effectively in the lungs, which is where the most severe consequences tend to come. Now, that was an announcement, not yet even a preprint paper, and I've had my attention drawn to some criticisms of the data on that as so far released. Those criticisms may or may not be addressed in the proper write-up. So, okay, suggestive, not to be relied upon just yet. Still, another line of inference to add to the solid base of evidence that's building up. All of this we knew before, but the modelers were still running their models exclusively with the assumption built in that Omicron would be as deadly as Delta. These models were producing scary results, feeding into scary headlines, and this week Scotland and Wales announced new restrictions based on the scary results and the scary headlines. Welsh Minister Mark Drakeford told the Welsh people that Omicron was probably just as severe as Delta. And let's face it, Boris would have done as well, except that members of the cabinet revolted against the advice that was coming from SAGE. They'd been reportedly passing around a report by JP Morgan highlighting the data bias in SAGE reports, and they used this to kick back hard against Whitty and Vallance. So that was then, but this week we started to get the first studies from the UK. So, proper people, not South Africans and Danes, people like us. The first, produced by Edinburgh University, found Omicron is associated with a 2/3 reduction in the risk of COVID-19 hospitalisation when compared to Delta. And the second, from the UK Health Security Agency, basically confirmed that finding, saying that it was 70% less likely to lead to hospitalisations and 45% less likely to turn up at accident and emergency. The University of Cambridge reported a study showing its own analysis exposing blood samples to pseudoviruses based on Omicron and Delta, and it reinforced the implications of that Hong Kong study, that Omicron was less effective in invading lung tissue. The icing on the cake was that Neil Ferguson's own operation, Imperial College, just a week ago saying that there was no evidence of milder disease, has now come through with an update saying that, yeah, actually there is such evidence. From them, a more miserly figure, 40% less likely to be hospitalised. Well, coming from Imperial, that's practically a recommendation you should package Omicron up and start selling it as a health supplement. However, unlike South Africa, we have seen deaths attributed to Omicron. If you are unlucky enough to develop more severe disease, you can still die from it. And the UK is reporting that from that single death mentioned by the Prime Minister last week, the Omicron toll has now moved to 14. There is still a frustrating lack of information being released about the situation of those people. The NHS should be publishing daily figures, giving numbers in hospital with Omicron, supported by data on vaccine status, comorbidities, whether they were admitted for COVID or for another reason. It was reported this week that 31% of COVID patients currently in hospital had already been in hospital for more than a week before testing positive, suggesting that infection happened on the ward, and therefore may well be mild in its own right. These distinctions are not routinely made when figures are reported, and they can be hard to find. Indeed, even what we thought we knew might not have been correct. The information about the first death, that he was an unvaccinated man in his 70s with no health issues who died in Northampton, that, it turns out, may well have been false. Northampton Hospital Service had said that there had been no Omicron deaths in their hospitals at that time. So the person who called into NPR radio could well have been either mistaken about his stepfather's death being because of Omicron, or I suppose he could have been faking to push a vaccination message, maybe. People do such things. Unfortunately, so few countries do much sequencing, we will be unlikely to get good data on Omicron deaths from many places at all, which is why some proper information from the UK would be helpful. But it's hard to get. What we're really seeing here is an emerging conflict being put into full profile between evidence-based medicine, looking to real-world data and studies, where there's always a frustrating time lag, of course, for decision makers, between that and the modelers. And now we're starting to see some real backlash. Ambrose Evans-Pritchard reported this in The Telegraph. Academic etiquette restrains direct criticism, but immunologists say privately that Professor Neil Ferguson and his team breached a cardinal rule by inferring rates of hospitalisation, severe disease and death from waning antibodies, and by extrapolating from infections that break through the first line of vaccine defence. Dr. Clive Dix, former chairman of the UK Vaccine Task Force, certainly was prepared to go on the record in robust form. It is bad science, and I think they're being irresponsible. They have a duty to reflect the true risks, but this is just headline grabbing. Professor Francois Ballou, the director of the UCL Genetics Institute, was slightly more restrained, but still pretty clear. To talk of 5,000 deaths a day is a very high number. It is risky to push apocalyptic scenarios that are highly unlikely to happen. What I am more worried about is a loss of trust in governments and public institutions for crying wolf. The mood is changing everywhere. One of the key challenges is that Imperial focused exclusively on neutralising antibodies, which are easy to measure. But if you ignore the body's next line of defence, B and T cell memory, which lasts for much longer but is harder to measure, you can't realistically pronounce on protection. The University of Cape Town told the journal Science, T cells are holding out against Omicron, and the data is very consistent across vaccines. From everything we know about T cells, this is what they do: control a virus once you've been infected. Nevertheless, Neil Ferguson declared over recent weeks that Omicron largely evades immunity. His group said that vaccine efficacy for the double vaccinated ranges from 0 to 20%. Well, that was misleading. And that prior claim of no evidence of being milder than Delta was based on what Evans Pritchard described as a vanishingly small sample with a too short timeline, and when they did not know the denominator of actual Omicron infections, since so many of them are asymptomatic and therefore not being reported. It's not just Ferguson in the spotlight though. The wider SAGE group has apparently run out of road with its constantly pessimistic messaging and policy advice. Fraser Nelson and Kate Andrews of The Spectator magazine reported on the latest SAGE memo to government, which they'd had sight of, which is apparently still calling for lockdown. They said that SAGE accepted that Omicron may have peaked in South Africa, contrary to its own talk about doubling times. It says that a similar trajectory may not be followed in the UK, however. SAGE says that milder scenario should not be assumed for planning purposes because... It says acting now would stop longer measures later, and limited, targeted measures don't work. Hence, lockdown should still be on the table. Nelson and Andrews make this observation: the document is phrased as if SAGE is collectively making the case for lockdown. In reality, SAGE is a huge number of experts, most of whom wish to provide advice but not lobby government for anything. But over the pandemic, SAGE advice has tended to be edited and summarised by those inside governments lobbying for more restrictions, which is worth bearing in mind if we're trying to locate where responsibility lies for the advice to date. Dr. Clive Dix again said that he assumed Chris Whitty went along with Ferguson's negative claims as a tool of policy, hoping to cajole more people into getting booster jabs, and observed that Anthony Fauci was thinking along the same lines in the US. Patrick Vallance mounted a defence today in the Times of London, suggesting it was not true, that modelers only model the worst outcomes, as the critics have been saying. It is not the job of SAGE to take a particular policy stance, or to either spread gloom or to give Panglossian optimism. Ministers need to hear the information, whether uncomfortable or encouraging. Part of the advice may contain a reasonable worst-case scenario, data that are often seized upon. But they are just that, a reasonable worst-case scenario and one of many possible outcomes. Now, it's not a persuasive defence because it doesn't match what we've seen, not in the slightest. When I chose my forthright title for last week's video about mild disease sweeping the nation, it was prompted by frustration that the emerging data was not being reflected at all in the public pronouncements. If they've been saying, well, the emerging evidence suggests that it's milder and here's what that would look like on this graph, but we have to bear in mind it might not play out that way here, and here's what the worst case would look like, another graph. Now, I would have been cool with that, but that's not what they did. The worst cases keep getting hyped up with the message that this is what will happen if we do nothing. We've been seeing that with our own eyes. It's too late to suggest that this is all just balanced scenario giving. This is why trust in the process is unravelling. And it's not just in the UK that the unravelling is taking place. A key plank of the CDC reported wisdom in America has also come under fire. The CDC's director has been repeatedly telling the American people that schools without mask mandates have triple the risk of COVID outbreaks. Now, I mean, that's significant, right? If you send your child to school and they don't require him or her to wear a mask all day, they are 3 times more likely to catch COVID and bring it home to share with the rest of the family. Remember, the World Health Organization does not recommend that children under the age of 6 should be required to wear masks, but the CDC in the US has been very aggressive on this. They recommended that all children aged 2 and older should be masked in school. CDC Director Rochelle Walensky came out with a statistic on CBS's Face the Nation in late September, and it made quite the impression. She cited a study from a couple of days earlier that looks at data from around 1,000 public schools in Arizona. The ones that didn't have mask mandates were 3.5 times more likely to experience COVID outbreaks than the ones that did, which is a huge difference, far bigger than had been seen in the literature to date. She went on to use that stat numerous times thereafter. Just one problem. As David Zweig revealed in an article for The Atlantic, it was junk. Noah Haber, a co-author of a systematic review of COVID-19 mitigation policies, called the research so unreliable that it probably should not have been entered into the public discourse. Why? Well, numerous failings. For one, the study ran from mid-July to the end of August, a 6-week period, but most of the schools only opened for the last 3 weeks of that. And more of the non-mandate schools opened for the longer period than the mandate schools. So you're now comparing schools that had 6 weeks to experience an outbreak against schools that only had 3 weeks, which is a clear weighting bias. The study didn't control for vaccination status, which is patently ridiculous, since what you're measuring would be directly affected by the percentage of vaccinated staff and students. Zweig tried to get the full list of schools in the study, but the authors wouldn't give it to him, nor would they give him their data, which is always a red flag. He went direct to the Arizona Department of Education with a public records request and got the list of schools anyway. It turned out that 40 of them were virtual learning academies, not bricks and mortar schools at all. So who's going to be catching COVID through that? About 20 were preschools and 90 were vocational programs associated with schools that were already in the study. Now, a different study in May looked at 90,000 students in Georgia and found the difference between schools where students were required to wear masks and those where they weren't were not statistically significant. There was a 37% reduction in schools where teachers and staff were required to wear masks, which sounds broadly in line with the rather weak added protection we know comes from very basic masks. Now, this is a problem. The director of the CDC has been using that figure to justify a policy. They want you to have faith in their institution, to be able to believe that their advice is well-founded in the research, follow the science and all that. Well, they've now been exposed in a high-profile piece as peddling junk data. And Zweig finished his article with this. With Biden in the White House, the CDC has promised to follow the science in its COVID policies. Yet the circumstances around the Arizona study seem to show the opposite. Dubious research has been cited after the fact without transparency in support of existing agency guidance. So this is my take. The last couple of years has been an experiment of how modern polarised politics tried and failed to engage the whole population on a matter of universal concern. Instead of frank honesty, they went for spin, for tightly motivated messaging, underpinned by sectional advantage and partisanship. As a result, they have failed to take a large segment of the population with them, and they have damaged trust in the key institutions that should have been unimpeachable in this situation. It'll be fascinating to see in 10 years' time what the real lessons of history will turn out to be about this strange period we're living through. On the plus side, the evidence is building that Omicron is milder, as you may already have heard from trustworthy narrators of recent events. Its massively increased transmissibility means that it may still put short-term pressure on health services, although the South Africa precedent there is good. Shorter hospital stays will reduce that pressure, and that seems likely. But the fact that lots of health workers have caught it and policies require them to isolate, that is more of a pressure point than the weight of cases right now. But we may see the situation where Omicron rips through the population, the vast majority of whom will only get mild or no disease, and they will then have natural immunity that will give COVID the final push to fall into the background as an endemic disease about which we no longer disrupt our lives. Alright, it's too early to say that that's how it plays out. We still need some caveats and uncertainties in there, but it's looking good. It is a bit of a prompt for older people with vulnerabilities who may not have vaccinated for whatever reason. And I don't campaign on this channel. I don't lecture people about how they assess their personal risk and exercise their free choice. It's worth noting that a lot of authorities with better track records than Some of the people we've been discussing in this episode reckon that everybody will be exposed to Omicron over the coming months. It is that transmissible. For most of us, that's not a problem on these figures. If you think you might be more vulnerable, you might just want to revisit your personal calculation of risk. Meanwhile, a couple of other short news stories that you might have missed. Christmas really has been confirmed as the season of goodwill, it seems, as we saw President Biden giving his predecessor, President Trump, credit for Operation Warp Speed that delivered the vaccines, as well as announcing that he'd received a booster, even in the face of boos from his supporters. Not only that, but President Trump said that he had appreciated Biden's gesture and thought that it was a great thing for him to have done. Far be it from me to make any observations of my own that might have the effect of breaking the spell of the magic of Christmas.
God bless us.
God bless us, everyone.
And another piece of good news, in my view at least, UK judges have delivered a free speech boost by ruling that the practice of police recording so-called non-crime hate incidents risked interfering with people's right to express their opinions. This came after Harry Miller, a former police constable, had won a court battle defending his right to tweet about transgender issues. Non-crime hate incidents have been described by police guidance as when a victim or anyone else perceived prejudice because of their race, religion, sexual orientation, disability, or because they are transgender. So get this, anyone can decide that you just did something that was inspired by hate. It doesn't have to be attached to you having done anything actually remotely illegal. And you don't have to be notified that it's been entered onto your record. But it could come out in an enhanced background check for certain kinds of jobs. Nearly 120,000 such incidents have been entered onto the police record. One of them could be on your record. I mean, I did a video discussing Abigail Schreier's book on the transgender craze seducing our children a few months ago. Perhaps that motivated someone to report me, and I wouldn't know. The judge said that this could have a chilling effect on free speech. You can kind of see why. The Free Speech Union has called for all of those entries now to be deleted en masse. If you're watching this video on the day of release, then tomorrow is Christmas, the time that is traditionally about families coming together and being unified in celebration. Now, of course, real life families aren't quite as straightforward as that, of course. As a verified black sheep, I can testify to that. But we try anyway. The principle that there's more that brings us together than divides us. This principle has been more tested this year, perhaps, than any other. This year we've been pushed to our limits by a pandemic that has hung around like a bad smell, about the political response to that, and the fact that how we feel about both of those things has now fallen into the domain of tribal identity. This has divided a lot of formerly close-knit groups, particularly between the tribally vaccinated versus the tribally unvaccinated. It may not have been the intent, but to a degree this has been done to us. As we step back and review where we are, we see that the government and its agencies have followed a nudge process designed to maximise the uptake of vaccination. And that has been to apply restrictions and threaten to apply additional restrictions and to impress upon the wider population that the unvaccinated are the reason why those restrictions might get applied. This uses the mechanism of peer pressure and shaming to make it more likely that the unvaccinated will cave to pressure and get the shots. But the consequence of that is to divide us along those lines. People that have taken the framing and decided that they're now thoroughly fed up of the refuseniks. Twitter's not real life, but it is the easiest place to witness the consequences of this in full technicolor. The selfish unvaccinated should pay for NHS treatment, given they refused it earlier. And just lock down the unvaccinated. And so on and so on. All of this comes down to framing. The facts are the facts, but how we see them can be very different. on one framing. As soon as everyone has had a chance to get vaccinated, and especially when treatments generally are more available as well, we can decide that everything's good. If I'm vaccinated, then I'm as well protected from serious disease and death as I can be. If you're not vaccinated, then that is your choice as a free adult human, and you take the risk and you take the consequences. I don't need to fear you, you don't need to fear me. We may get problems that put strains on our health service, and that is an administrative matter, an organisational problem to be solved with planning and resources. Now, there's nothing to stop us from taking that framing right now, today. You don't need the government's permission to treat the personal decisions of your fellow family members, community members, and so on with respect, whatever they are. That doesn't mean that you can't seek to persuade them if you think that their reasoning is based on, for instance, claims that are demonstrably wrong, factually wrong. But you do so on the basis of unconditional love and acceptance, because a third party, such as a virus, can take someone away from you earlier than you would have wished. But if you alienate yourself from them, because you choose to frame your situation in a tribal and divisive way, then you lose them anyway, much more assuredly, and through your own choices, not because of the intervention of a virus. Which is all just a long-winded way of saying, have a good Christmas, all, in spite of everything that's been done to grind us down in 2021, rise above it and celebrate. All right. No deep dive video on Monday because, yes, indeed, I will be enjoying Christmas, not making videos tomorrow, as well as planning, of course, the new year of content. But there will definitely be another Friday News Roundup video on New Year's Eve because, as we say, some things here are sacred. My grateful thanks, as always, go to the people who support this channel on Patreon. I could not have produced videos through this year, at least one every single week, and usually 3 per week, without that support. It has enabled me to feel free to talk about the important topics, regardless of whether YouTube might demonetize them as a result. It has enabled me to keep going post March the 6th, when YouTube tweaked its algorithm and stopped recommending videos from this channel to non-subscribers in anything like the way that it had been doing before. And it has given me a community of people demonstrably cheering me on to succeed and to keep going to make better videos. And that makes a huge difference. If you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great Christmas. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.